Yeah, definitely. I mean, our SDKs, because it's a key part of our product, um, are their own team. So
Yeah.
our developer experience team is kind of, even when there was a separate developer experience team in engineering, um, that was always independent of the SDKs, and because we are kind of unique in the way we that the way the role SDKs play in integration.
Yeah. And that's something I wanted to dive into with you, which is I looked at Launch Darkly's site and I saw that you had 14 different server-side SDKs and 15 client-side SDKs, which to me feels a little unusual. And I was wondering, like, what's the story behind that?
Yeah, so I mean it's kind of one of our key differentiators. So if you're using feature flags, like it can be with just about anything, right? It doesn't there's no limitation. It's not like, oh, if you're going to use feature flags, you have to use this language or that language, right? It can be you might even have multiple languages within the same project that actually even use the same flags, like because we have a server side portion of a feature and the client side portion of a feature, and maybe even there's some portion of that feature that's in um, our API that's written in something else, so you can have multiple different languages involved. So you have to be able to use that across these different tools. So of course you could do that with an API, and you can do that with our API, but we really push you towards the SDKs for a number of reasons. So one of the things about that's interesting, because I talk a lot about I talk to developers and they're like, oh, why would I need to pay somebody for feature flags when like that's just a simple problem to solve? It's a config value or whatever, right? Like big deal. And then, as you start to think about feature flags and it gets more and more complicated the further you dig into it, as with almost any developer problem. um, so as an example, if I'm going to implement a kill switch, which is basically like I want to be able to turn off this feature if there's some kind of problem, and that way it's no longer in production, problem's gone. Well, I need that to be immediate, right? So I want to be able to say like I killed that and it's now off in production. I'm not waiting for some build to deploy or some new config value to be pushed out and then maybe have to restart the app to pull in new config values. I mean, there's all these different scenarios I've heard of. So you want that pushed out immediately. So you can't easily do that with an API, right? I mean, having you implement that at your end it can't easily be done with an API. So our SDKs do a lot of really unique things that are kind of, I think, critical features of using us. So like, as an example, when you integrate a server-side SDK, it pulls down all the rules for all the flags that in the environment you're connected to when you launch Darkly, right?
Yeah.
And why it does that is it stores it in a in-memory cache, and that way it's incredibly fast. It doesn't actually have to go to launch Darkly to evaluate any flags. It can actually pull all the rules and evaluate flags all on the server without ever having to communicate with launch Darkly. And what we do is we open like a stream that then pushes anytime you change something in launch Darkly, that gets pushed within like I think 20 milliseconds or something like that, or 200 milliseconds, I think is what we quote, gets pushed down to that server. So that way, immediately, like you flip that, it's almost immediate. You flip that switch, you see that feature turn off. But at the same time, when you're evaluating flags on the server, even though you have hundreds of users on the server, their flags are evaluated extremely quickly because that's all sitting in an in-memory cache. So the point is like you're not directly communicating with the API because all of these features are built into the SDK. So the reason you end up using the API is generally speaking because either you have one of the languages that isn't supported by one of the 28 or 29 different SDKs, which is, not typical. Most people are using those. Or you're trying to do something that's outside of what the SDK does, which is mostly just reading flag values and handling analytics events that get sent back. So like if you needed to create a new user profile, in the system, or you needed to actually generate a new flag or things like that, like those are typically where you'd use the API, and because you can't do that with the SDK.
Interesting. So when you say when you differentiate between using the API and using the SDK is using all of your public APIs. It's just You've wrapped it in a nice interface that has a lot of bells and whistles that people could technically write themselves, but why would you ask your customers to write all of that code and introduce more complexity into their code base when you've already solved that problem for them, and you have a vested interest in making sure that SDK is up to date and functioning for all your customers?
Exactly. So, I think implementing that on your own, it's entirely possible, but why you'd want to get into the business of maintaining that is beyond me. And you get all that kind of built in. So yeah, I guess that's part of the improving the developer experience. You get all of these features just out of the box with the SDKs. Not our SDKs are not just a pure wrapper over the API to make it simpler to use. It adds a ton of features that you just won't get if you go directly through the API.
Interesting. I really like how you described you could potentially be using 3 different SDKs inside of the same application because things are written in different languages by different teams. And, you got to have, that's why that totally answers my question of why you have such a broad support for so many different languages and client side and server side. Now, you mentioned that there was a team that owns that. Do you consider the SDKs like part of your product? Is it part of is there a specific engineering team at LaunchDarkly that owns it with product managers and all that?
Yes. Yep, there is. So that's, like I said, it is a core part of our offering. So yeah, there's an SDK team that has, a product manager that determines what new SDKs we're going to work on or updates to the existing SDKs and so on. So yeah, it's like I said, it would not be. It's such a big task. It's not something even like a couple of developer experience engineers could really do as like, okay, I maintain this SDK for fun on the side kind of thing. Yeah.
I think you just summarized a lot of people's lives, which is I'm maintaining an SDK on the side for fun. And, you got to wonder like, like that's just that's really interesting. Like LaunchDarkly really has put, I guess SDKs as like a first-class citizen as far as the product. So